Hi, yeah, thanks, Chris. So this paper session is going to be about digital innovation. And we have three papers on the docket. I don't know if everyone is here yet, but the basic kind of flow is that we have a paper by Neil Thompson, Didier Bonnet, and Sarah Jabala. That's on open innovation broadly. So looking at where firms kind of source their innovations internally versus externally. We have a few other papers, uh, one following after that. Again, if all the authors are here, that's basically looking at how external knowledge is sourced. So we're starting off with external sort of versus internal and when and how that happens, and then moving on to really a practice-based view of how the knowledge is sourced externally and integrated, and ending with a paper on essentially how firms manage to lobby regulators in undemocratic environments to be more amenable to their innovations. So I think we're going to start with Thompson, Bonnet, and Jabala, from what I understand. And the title of this paper is Sourcing Innovation in the Digital Age. Let's see, do we have everyone here?
And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. All right. Well, thank you very much for having us present this paper. I'm looking forward to the feedback. I was guessing sort of you were aiming for about 10 to 15 minutes. Is that about right? Given the three papers?
That's right.
Okay, great. Okay, so so what I want to talk to you about today is a new survey that I've done with my two co-authors here. And it comes out of some basically discussions that I've had. So my two co-authors here, Didier is joint between IMD on the academic side, but also Capgemini Invent on the consulting side, and Sarah is on the consulting side. And we just had these discussions where we were sort of frustrated because you know, you see sort of academic surveys that are done, and they're usually doing something, using something like the Community Innovation Survey, which is of course great, but often the Community Innovation Survey only has, like, in a particular year, does it have a couple of questions that are really useful for open innovation or something like that? And so you'll see a lot of people picking, like, you know, Finnish manufacturing companies to look at something. And then, or you'll see things that will be like very interesting, like some of the work that Wes Cohen and co-authors have done about looking at, say, the U.S. manufacturing sector, which is, you know, very detailed, but again, sort of very specific to the United States. And then at the other side, you see sort of what's going on the practitioner side, and you see these surveys that are being done of, you know, hundreds or thousands of firms, but the sampling is all wrong, right? There's no, you know, and there's the sort of analysis of sort of a lot of the interesting questions you want just isn't there. And so a number of years ago, we got together and said, okay, let's see if we can sort of pick something in the middle of these things where we'll try and do it rigorously, but we'll also do a cross-country survey, and we'll try and update the thing. I mean, I think an important thing to say is that a lot of these surveys, you know, it takes a lot of effort to do, and so they don't tend to happen all that often. And in fact, like, I think the sort of most recent big one of this was the Cohen, Aurora Cohen and Walsh paper, and that was on data from 2010. Right, and so a big part of this that matters is what's happening in this digital age, because we see all of this digital transformation happening, right? And the question is sort of how is that playing out in firms? So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. So to give you a little bit of a, oh, there we go. So this is going to be the scope of the survey. So as I mentioned, so the nice thing is we're going to be looking across 8 different countries, and we're going to look across 7 different industries here, and we're going to be very careful about sampling so that we're getting the same percentage of automotive in the United States versus other countries, and so we're going to be well matched on all those things. So this is really going to be sort of an apples to apples comparison across them. We're also going to be very careful about our sampling. So we're going to, for each of these categories, if we think about, like, in the United States and automotive, we'll take the full set of companies that fall into our category, and then we will randomly sample from amongst them. So these are also representative of what is going on in these countries. with that said, what we're going to do is we're going to actually go to particularly innovation leaders at these firms. So these might be the head of innovation. Sometimes it's the CEO. It depends who's in charge. They're going to be, we're going to have a total of 300 publicly traded companies, and they're all going to be very large firms with revenues of 500 million or more. Okay. All right, so that's going to be our setting for this. And you might ask, so why is this survey different? So I've already hinted at this a little bit. So we're going to be looking across 7 different industries. So not just, for example, in manufacturing, and also across 8 different countries, which is pretty unusual for these kind of surveys. And then it's going to be this sort of first survey in the digital era. So that's going to be important. We're also going to make a couple of other methodological choices, which are going to differ us a little bit from the work that has come beforehand, but I think things that are useful in terms of sort of the managerial relevance of what we're going to find. So one thing that's important here is sort of a guiding post for a lot of these innovation surveys is the Oslo manual. And there they have a recommendation that when people focus on innovations that are coming into the company, they focus on these new to the industry applications. So when are you the firm that sort of leads and says, we're going to bring this inside, and be the first one in the industry to do it? That is, of course, certainly very important and incredibly important when you want to think about what is happening at the industry level. But I'm not sure it's the right thing when you're thinking about an individual firm level. And we really saw this in some of the survey work we did, where we sampled in a small number of people and said, well, actually, how important is this to you? And actually, only 27% of the firms said that their most successful innovation was something that had come from outside the industry, right? Most of the things were things that they brought in from outside and often combined with their own things. So I'm not going to talk about it very much today, but we have a paper under review at SMJ at the moment where we're precisely showing that, in fact, a lot of what seems to be going on that makes innovation successful comes from this sort of recombination of taking something from outside and combining it with things that you have inside to create an innovation that is more transformative or more radical than you actually anticipated when you first created it. Okay, so if only 27% of firms' most successful innovation is from this new to the industry, then of course we also want to think about things that are just new to the firm. And so that we are going to include those in our data. The other thing that's going to be different here is, again, the Oslo manual's recommendation is that these surveys focus on a single focal innovation. So you say something like, what was your most important or what was your most successful innovation over a period of time? And then people give you sort of like the source that they use for that innovation, and you can sort of follow along with that particular example. And there's sort of a very good reason for that, because it makes it very concrete. Because actually what that innovation, where that innovation comes from, and people can think through the specific example. We are going to do that. We are going to have that focal innovation here, but we're also going to ask some questions at the whole firm level. So like, what is the most important innovation source for your firm? And what you're going to see is we're actually going to get quite a different picture. But I think that contrast is going to be very interesting to think about. All right, so that's where we're going. Let me now show you, just to start out, the kind of information that we're getting here. So this is an example of the innovation sources that firms are using and what percentage of them are. And so at the far left-hand side, you can see that 86% of firms are saying that they innovate with their suppliers. Okay, and this, I think, makes a lot of sense if you think about sort of doing innovation along your supply chain. These are very big firms, so that's, you can easily imagine them working with their material supplier or, semiconductor or something like that, having those kind of relationships. So that, I think that definitely makes sense. 79% have this central R&D lab, okay? One that was a surprise to us, 64% are working with universities, right? And you'll actually see in a couple of slides, that actually is a substantial increase on where we were just 5 or 6 years ago. Next, we have business unit staff. And here I want to break this up into what dedicated and which you'll see a little bit later here, operational. So business unit staff, first of all, we want to contrast them with central R&D because these are folks who are actually in the business units doing things. And so you might imagine they'd be a little more customer facing than central R&D. And the dedicated folks are ones that are like 100% of their job is actually working on innovation. Whereas where we're going to get over here is the operational folks. Those are ones that sort of have a day job, and then they also get a little bit of their time to do innovation. And so we actually thought when we came into the survey, we anticipated this would be much bigger because people like 3M and Google do like the 20% time, right? Those are the kind of people we had in mind, which you can see is actually, that's actually more of an exception than a rule in these large companies. Okay, we also see third party. So these are like independent experts, consultants, those kind of people coming in, 54%. Customers, this would also be like user innovation falls into this category. About 41% of firms are doing that. And then we have what innovation labs here. And here, this is an important distinction between central R&D. So by innovation lab, we don't just mean that you have like a lab. We mean that you actually have, you built a lab in a sort of rich innovation ecosystem in order to benefit from it. So you can think of like, Walmart putting up something in Silicon Valley would fall into this category of they want to be part of that ecosystem. And then as we get to the right here, we see a number of these sources that are certainly much talked about, but you can see are actually not used by as many firms as you might expect. So startups by 32%, crowd by only 18%. And so you just, still firms using them, but not as much as you might expect. And then here you have competitors, and this can be a range of things. So this can be like reverse engineering, which your competitor did, but it can also be, for example, pre-competitive research or things like that. Okay, so this is sort of a first overview of what's going on in this. The first thing we want to say is talk a little bit about the open innovation part, as was mentioned in the introduction. And what you can see is that now almost all big companies are doing external innovation, right? So there's sort of famous article written about that, not made here, we don't want that here. You see actually, this is the number of external sources that a firm is using, and this is the share of companies that are using it. And first of all, you can see almost nobody is using no sources. Everybody's using at least one, and you can see actually many of firms are using 4, 5, 6 different external sources to pull in innovation. It's worth saying, I didn't put in a slide on this, but it's worth saying as well that this expansion that we see into external innovation does not seem to be coming at the cost of internal innovation sources. So it's not like we're shutting down our internal BU, but now we're working with startups. That's not what's going on here. Firms seem to be expanding their portfolio of innovation sources, and that includes both external sources and internal sources as well. All right. Now, I mentioned before that we saw this increase from universities. I actually want to make that concrete because this was one of the biggest surprises we had. So this is showing the shift of the number of companies that are using different innovation sources across the 2 years prior to our survey. And really just a remarkable number starting to work with universities here. Okay, so big change that, and that's certainly something we are seeing at MIT. There's been a massive expansion in a lot of our industry outreach, but you can really see it here, and certainly not, we were not expecting that to come in, for example, higher than startups, but indeed it is. You see 13% of firms have started working with startups over the 2 years prior to our survey, number with third party, et cetera, on the way down. You can see what I was mentioning before about some of these ones at the right-hand side about like change in the number of people doing 20% time, basically zero. And so you can have this break. Now, one of the things that is also very interesting is you can take these innovation sources and you can say, well, if we sort of ordered them by the ones that were more focused on innovations that were primarily digital, right? So, it could be machine learning, but it can also be sensors or anything like that. What you'd see is that the top 5 or 6 are going to be these ones. Okay, it is precisely the ones that have expanded a lot, which are the ones where digital technology is what people are using to source from them. And so, it's an important caveat here. All of this is, of course, a cross-sectional survey. We cannot make very strong causal claims, but it is a very striking correlation we see that, in fact, there's such a focus on digital technologies in these sources. Okay, now both of these, so what I've shown you so far is just sort of what sources people are using. Of course, we might want to ask also, what's the most important innovation source that they're doing? And so I'm going to show you this in 2 ways, and this is what I sort of teased earlier. So first of all, I'm going to show you this in the dark green at the company level. So this is overall what was the most important source for your firm. And you can see 58% of firms said their most important source was central R&D. 13% said it was these innovation labs and these rich innovation ecosystems. And then their business unit staff collectively accounted for about another 20%. And you can see a lot of these external sources are just not the most important overall, right? You get, 2% said universities were, and some of the interviews we talked about were firms that really had totally integrated their innovation system with universities, so that kind of makes sense. But it was certainly the exception rather than the rule. And then you see suppliers and customers, as you might expect, with some small numbers there. Now we're going to ask it the way that the Oslo manual asks it about what is the most important project. And here you see a pretty different pattern. So central R&D goes down in importance. Innovation labs actually go up. I thought that was quite interesting, right? That says that perhaps the reason, because there's been an enormous expansion in the number of innovation labs being built in Silicon Valley, which is where, I mean, I presume it's true more broadly, but that's where we have the data that I know of. Huge expansion there, and it's certainly very consistent with this result of innovation projects coming and being very important to the firm. You can see, business unit staff, but here you can see universities becoming more important and suppliers becoming more important. And that is at least sort of directionally more consistent with what we see from, for example, the work that Cohen et al. Did on US manufacturing, of those becoming more important. But it is really important to say, like, a major difference that our survey finds is that these internal sources are overwhelmingly the most important thing that a firm is using to innovate. And I think that's really important to say, yes, open innovation is happening, but it is not that the internal sources are either being jettisoned or that they are not important. Actually, they remain significantly the most important thing that a firm is doing. Okay, so I now want to just talk a little bit more about what we can say about why people might be moving to these external sources. And I want to start with just sort of the old resource capability-based view of the firm and ask, for the particular innovation projects that firms were telling us about, how well did your firm's resources and capabilities fit with the particular type of innovation that you were doing? So, and what you see here is this very interesting pattern. So let's start on the left-hand side here with the fact that nobody thinks that their capabilities are weaker than like the average firm, right? So this is like everybody's at least as good an average driver, right? This is apparently people think that they're all at least as good as average an innovator. But I think, we can still sort of say, if you're saying like your capabilities in this area are just equal to many, many others in the field, you're kind of in the middle there. 51% of firms said for their most important innovation, that was their level of capabilities. 40% said that they were as good as leaders in the field, but not better. And only 9% said that their capabilities were better. Okay, so that, I think that sort of, we might imagine that there would be some kind of distribution like this. There's probably a little truncation over here, but that makes sense. But I think it's been very powerful to then turn this around and go back to, where are you sourcing your innovation? And say, okay, well, if you are equal to many others, so these are the three categories where we actually had answers, right? I cut off the left-hand side, but if you're equal to many others, well, actually, only a third of the time are you producing that innovation internally. 2/3 of the time, you're going external to get the technology or the expertise to do it. Now, if you say, well, actually, our capabilities and resources are as good as leaders in the field, actually now 3/4 of the time you do it internally, and only 26% of the time you do it externally. And if you're actually a leader in the field, not surprisingly, like 96% of the time you do something internally, right? And so I think directionally, this is not at all surprising, but at least I was surprised by how strong this effect was, right? I mean, this really says, or really suggests, since we can't get causality here exactly, but it really suggests that this capabilities resource-based view is just, responsible for an enormous part of the choice about whether you go external or not. Okay, and then the last thing I want to do is, one of the nice things about asking about particular projects is that we can also ask about the competitive advantage that particular innovation project gave to the firm. And so we asked them in particular, how enduring was the advantage that your company gained? And we're just going to, they could say persistent advantage, or they could say a whole bunch of like sort of short term, we got some advantage, but then we lost it, or we never had advantage in the first place. And what's interesting here is if you look at, well, when you developed it internally, what percentage of projects got this competitive advantage? 89%. If you go externally, it's only 61%, right? And I think this is very interesting because it suggests that, you went to those external sources because you didn't have the capabilities and resources internally to do this, right? And so particularly for digital technologies, I should say, we see this a lot. You go externally, you get access to those skills, but actually those technologies, when you bring them back into your firm, are less likely to give you competitive advantage. Now, it's still not terrible, right? 61% is not a terrible number, but it's, you know, a lot less than the 89%. And that suggests that maybe this trade-off. And I think sort of intuitively, that's what we might expect, because we might say, well, if a startup is selling to you to give you a particular project, they might also be selling to one of your competitors, and then you'd expect to get less of a competitive advantage from it. Okay, so just to summarize then, this work provides a new cross-country, cross-industry survey that is representative and designed to be managerially relevant. And actually, let me put in a little bit of a plug here, because even though we are cross-country and cross-industry, I actually haven't talked to you very much about that part yet. So the teaser will be a little bit that it's interesting when we look across these 8 countries, what we see is a remarkably common set of interactions. It seems like many of these big firms are interacting with their environment in the same way. The exception is China. We see something notably different in China, and we will actually have hopefully a paper draft coming out in the next few weeks that will really outline that. But what we see there in particular is that Chinese firms are much closer to their customers than seem to be some of these the ones in all of the other 7 countries, which look fairly similar. We also see that firms are expanding the number of innovation sources that they're using. This is particularly to access digital technologies in areas with low internal capabilities, and it's not a shift towards virtual innovation. And lastly, we see that internal sources are more important than previous research has found. They're most important for 90% of large companies, and they provide more competitive advantage, which would sort of explain why we would expect that to be true. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Neil. Yeah, very interesting survey. I can, off the top of my head, think of some interesting follow-up uses for it. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. So it looks like our next paper is going to be Uni Wen from Oxford. I think actually a nice follow-up to Neil's presentation. You know, he was sort of looking at leveraging innovation capabilities within industries. And Uni Wen's paper is going to be largely about how you know, innovative firms leverage resources to maintain relationships with regulators and sort of extra industry players. So Uni, if you are here, you can start sharing whenever you're ready.
Can you see it? Hi. Can you see it? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Uni Wen. I'm from Oxford. My study focuses on how digital technology companies overcome the regulatory challenge in authoritarian countries. You may have read from the news that many digital technology companies have run into regulatory problems. For example, Uber does not fit in the existing taxi regulation. Airbnb has challenged the hotel regulation, and digital currency like Bitcoins does not fit in the current currency regulation. So they have been in a legal gray areas. But similarly, those digital technology have emerged in authoritarian countries like China. They have challenged the existing regulations there too. Like Didi is the biggest ride-sharing company in China. They have similarly challenged the existing taxi regulation and industry. And Ant Financial, which started from Alipay in Alibaba, they have challenged the traditional banking system and regulation in China. And just a few days ago, the Chinese government has stopped it from going public. And peer-to-peer lending platform, they have experienced explosive growth a few years ago in China, but it's been cracked down by the Chinese government as well. So the difference between the two sets of companies is that digital technology companies in democratic countries, they have democratic channels to influence public policy making and to change policies. They can hire an army of lobbyists to directly influence policymakers, or they can mobilize the public, like protests or petition to influence policymaking. However, in authoritarian countries like China, the situation is very different. These companies have no institutionalized democratic channel to influence policymaking, and compared to the incumbent who have personal access to the political machinery in an authoritarian country, this emerging force has no access. And on the other hand, they cannot resort to radical political activities like protests, which is very risky in authoritarian countries. So my question is, how do digital technology companies achieve legal acceptance in an authoritarian country? So to answer this question, I did a case study on the ride-sharing industry in China, mainly Didi, Uber China, and eDao. This industry has challenged the existing taxi regulation, and they have been facing government suppression across the country. And it is also the first case in China that a private company have successfully pushed a new regulation for digital technologies. But more interestingly, there is a great contrast between the draft regulation and finalized regulation on the ride-sharing industry. You can see here the draft regulation issued by the Ministry of Transportation in October 2015, which is very, very hostile to the new industry. For example, the industry was defined as secondary to the taxi industry, and the ride-sharing price should be controlled by the government, and the ride-sharing vehicle should be registered as a subtype of taxis. And municipal government can even decide the number of ride-sharing cars in the city. So this is a very hostile version regulation for the ride-sharing industry. But the finalized version, which was issued in July 2016, which is much more friendly. For example, the industry is no longer secondary to the taxi industry. It's an independent and separate industry. The price can be determined by the market, and ride-sharing vehicles can be registered as a separate category of ride-sharing vehicles, and there's no requirement on the number of ride-sharing cars. So I would like to know what leads to these contrasting regulatory outcomes and what happened during the year from 2015 to 2016. So I interviewed more than 50 people in the ride-sharing companies and government officials, and find out this contrasting regulatory outcome is caused by the corporate political strategy shift by ride-sharing companies. In period 1, which is before the hostile draft regulation, ride-sharing companies were mainly engaged in direct confrontation with the government. But in period 2, which is before the friendly finalized regulation, they switched towards a strategy, what I called radical resistance. So I go through this 2 period. Period 1, direct confrontation. In China, the taxi industry have been woven with the local transport officials. So when the new ride-sharing industry threatens the taxi industry, the local transport officials have been severely punished the new industry, either by fining or arresting the ride-sharing drivers, or just directly issuing cease and desist order. So in response, ride-sharing companies, like their counterparts in America, like Uber and Lyft, they just went around the local transport officials. They were making their own industry regulation. They get together, issue industry regulation, and they also sued local transport authorities, which is a very radical move in Chinese context. And during that time, there were quite a few ride-sharing driver gathering events. And this picture shows such an event. The people in blue uniform are local transport officials, and the other peoples are ride-sharing drivers. They are literally directly confronting with each other. And during that time, ride-sharing companies are also very outspoken on mass media, directly criticizing the local government's suppression. They also aim to crush the taxi industry. They publicly say the taxi industry is prehistory and outdated, but they themselves represent the innovative future. So this is quite similar to what Uber did, maybe less radical in the democratic countries, but as a result of direct confrontation strategy, they have experienced very bitter outcomes, which is a very hostile draft regulation by the Ministry of Transportation. So at this time, they realized they have to shift to corporate political strategy. In period 2, their strategy is more similar to the radical resistance strategy. The concept was initially developed by political scientist O'Brien Lee to explain Chinese peasants They argue that the weak population can always utilize the fragmented state, where what is impermissible in one division may be tolerable or even supported by another division in order to push their ends. So similarly, the ride-sharing industry is relatively weak force compared to the incumbent taxis, so they can use the similar strategies. There are three elements of ride-for resistance strategy. First, they can seek support from powerful third parties. As the first step, ride-sharing companies reach out to the top leaders. These two pictures shows the Didi CEO was shaking hands with Premier Li and President Xi, and they widely circulate this picture to show that they have get acceptance from top leaders. They also seek support from other ministries other than the hostile transportation departments. For example, they emphasize their contribution to local economy, so they get support from the National Development and Reform Committee, which is a macroeconomic agency in China. They also emphasize that they are a technology company, not a transportation company. So they are backed by the Ministry of Information Technology. They also emphasize their contribution to job opportunity creation, so they can get a great support from the Ministry of Human Resources. And the second element of ride for resistance is to use the rhetoric of the central policies. Many interviewees from the company told me in period one, they would just simply stated whatever they want in their communication with the government. But later they realized they need to align the demands with the priorities of the central government. So in the letters, in the company's letter to the government, you can find these typical sentences or phrases like we committed to the mass entrepreneurship and innovation campaign promoted by Premier Li. Didi, as the representative of ride-sharing platform, tries to optimize the city transport supply with the use of technology. We strive to become the pioneer of the supply-demand reform. And the third element of ride for resistance is to seek coexistence with incumbent, which is very ironical. In the first period, they would just want to crush the taxi industry purely for the business reason. But later they realized a sudden collapse of the incumbent industry will lead to social insecurity. And that's the last thing the Chinese government want to see. So because for that reason, they have to seek coexistence with incumbents. So in period two, Didi CEO publicly announced that Didi is not seeking radical disruption, but harmonious development with the taxi industry. So as example, they even created joint company in many cities where the taxi company is in charge of the offline part, like recruiting drivers and maintaining vehicles, and Didi is in charge of the online part, like data management and ride arrangement. So in summary, if a digital technology company is involved in regulatory challenges in authoritarian country, they should not involve in direct confrontation with the government as their counterparts did in democratic countries. Instead, they should use ride for resistance strategies, which is to seek support from powerful third parties, to use the rhetoric of the central policies, and to seek coexistence with incumbents. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yini. Very timely paper too. So I think we actually are short an author. So Lourdes, do you want to move ahead with your paper session?
Sure, sorry, I was in mute. Okay, so then we have, yeah. So we don't have Roberto Gamarra from Gallaudet University?
No, Lourdes, I've looked. I haven't been able to
Okay, very good.
them.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so then we move to the next session. So thank you very much. Or maybe we can give some minutes for questions because we still have a little bit of time. actually have a question for Neil.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to have questions.
Yeah, so let's have a question. So then, Neil, I understand that there is a innovation survey for corporations in China that is quite well accepted. And so have you looked at it? And is that similar to yours, or because that could be very interesting to have the contrast between both. And also in relation with that, I see very often in Chinese companies some kind of incremental innovations. So the innovations are very small, you try and fail, and then either you move on or you try something else. So I've seen often Chinese companies that are classified as conservative, I've seen exactly the opposite. They don't mind failing, and so trial and error. How do you see that?
Yeah, great. So to the different parts, so the China survey that I think you're talking about, we did not consult before this particular paper we wrote, but because in this paper we started to see some differences with China, we actually the following year did a whole second wave of the survey. So it's 300 companies just in China. So we have much more resolution there, and there one of my co-authors is a Chinese innovation expert. So that's how we sort of brought that in. So to your specific question, one of the things we wanted to look at exactly was this question of, is what's going on in the innovation in China more incremental, right? And the short answer is no. So we can look at that both in terms of the investment that firms are making in innovation, and what we see is the sort of shares of innovation budget that are going to incremental versus like more substantial versus very radical stuff is very consistent between China and the rest of the world. So there's not a big difference there. And as well, when you ask them about the actual outcome that you get from these projects, you get answers that are very, very similar to the rest of the world. And so I think that's very representative. Like this idea that it was more incremental, I think is something that was probably true 20 or 30 years ago. And I think as a number of these Chinese firms have risen, as you pointed out earlier in your initial presentation, and gotten on some of the biggest firms in the world now, they've become innovation leaders in the way that you would expect other firms in the rest of the world.
Daniel?
Yeah, this is for Uni. Uni, I wonder if you have laid out the difference between righteous resistance and standard stakeholder theory. It strikes me that I'm not sure they were that much different. I'm sure that you think that they are, and I'd like to hear more about why.
You mean standard stakeholder theory? How is the right for resistance different to that? Yeah, for the right for resistance theory is developed by political scientists. They mainly emphasize the division within the government structure. So the emphasis is not the resistor, but the target, which is the government. So the weak resistor can take advantage of the division within the government. So they didn't differentiate what stakeholders they are, but they just say anyone who are, even they're weak, they can take advantage of that and to push their own ends. That's my understanding.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question to Neil? So yeah, Neil, I thought the results of the survey were very interesting and very related to a lot of the things that I'm trying to pursue now. I'm curious, I didn't see it in the survey. Do you have any sense, or is there a way to figure out from these firms, what kind of relationships they managed with their external partners? Like were some of them, sort of outsourcing contract innovation, and did others maybe have more of a long-term ongoing relationships, as we often see like with universities? Did you have any way of capturing that?
Yeah, so so let me give you the short answer and the long answer. The short answer is we did not ask about the specific way that they were interacting with them. But what we did ask about was, for each innovation source, we asked firms, when you're working with this internal or external source, like how internal or external is it? Right. So, we sort of have this mind that working with a startup can be external, but in fact, many startups that you could just bring them, you have an incubator, maybe you're working with them incredibly closely. And then you might say, well, 80% of the resources that are going into that innovation collaboration are still internal, even though we're working with the startup and it's external. And so we did look at that. What is interesting is if you look at the pattern of where the expansion is coming, it's coming not at the extremes, but in the middle. So like you have some sources like central R&D, which are sort of very internal, right? And you have some sources like suppliers and stuff that are very external. And you can see when people innovate with those, it's sort of 90% this way or 90% that way. But then you see like innovation labs and universities, and a lot of those actually sit in this middle where the mix of resources is much more even between the external and the internal. So that's, I can't answer your question specifically, but I think that at least tells you that it's, a lot of this is not just sort of like send it out and then have it just come back at some point. A lot of it is this collaborative stuff, and those are the sources that tend to be growing the fastest.
Thank you.
Any other questions? There are no questions in Q&A, and we have more than 50 people participating right now. So please write questions in Q&A.
I have a question to Uni. I just wonder, how's your conclusion, your model different from lobbying strategies in more democratic societies? Can you just give us some more details about the differences? You said you compare between authoritarian regime with democratic societies. So I just wonder how your findings are different from those strategies studied in more democratic societies.
Yes, I actually have another paper on Uber's strategy in the United States. They mainly, in the United States, Uber use one strategy is the traditional lobbying. It's very direct and direct influence on policymaker. And the other strategy is to mobilize their own users. That's a typical grassroots mobilization, but they have one more resources, which is the mass of the users. So I compare these two strategies in the in the US context and find out both are effective, but the user mobilization is more effective. But the result in the US is that user mobilization strategy is not completely aligned with the company's interests, because the users want a cheaper price. They want more safety measures. So the regulation enacted as a result of the user mobilization strategy is in the interest of the users, not in the interest of the company. So in the democratic channels, they can use to institutionalize democratic channels or the very radical protest or mobilization to do that. But in China, they can do neither. They don't have a transparent lobbying channels, but we have been talking about Guanxi personal access. But for emerging companies like Didi, they have no such context in comparison to taxi companies that have been woven with the local officials. So they basically have no such access. On the other hand, they cannot mobilize any public to do that, because in China, it's a very sensitive thing to do. So I just wonder in this context what they can do. So that's the mobilization of the paper.
Right. They do leverage lots of their personal political ties.
Yeah.
The premier, especially I think the when you studied it, have they already hired the Lenovo's founder's daughter? Is she one of the? Is she the CEO at that time, or?
Yeah,
chairman?
But that's generally a relatively later stage of the company when they have grown to a certain scale. They can hire such a high-end people.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, so then maybe we can move to the other one.